Welcome to Maps and Meta-Analysis.
Looking at California cities. Hi, I'm Darvesh
And I'm Justin Hurst, and this is Facts and Folsom,
a meta-analysis.
Hello, and welcome back to Maps and Meta-Analysis. Facts and Folsom, this is the season that we're doing right now. I wanted to just give a brief note. I know last week's podcast was rather long, so hopefully this one's will be kind of shorter. Darvesh and I are going to talk about the importance of local government, intermixing a little bit of what we know generally cities do, to an extent counties, and then also like why those things are valuable. But before we really get into it, I want to make a quick note. We talk a lot about the Chamber of Commerce, and we also talk a lot about City Council and city services. So I want to distinguish the two real quick off the bat. And generally speaking, a lot of what we'll be saying in this episode and right now for Chambers of Commerce are general. City to city, region to region will differ what they do, but largely speaking, some of the roles are very based in a common thread. So for the Chamber of Commerce, for example, in the city of Folsom, the role of the Chamber of Commerce is to promote, support, and advocate for small businesses. And the Chamber of Commerce also serves as a liaison between those small businesses and the City Council. So it is distinct from the city in that it is not like under the City Council, but it does serve a role that is complementary to it.
Gotcha. Okay, that's helpful clarification because I feel like they're almost like talked about in the same breath a lot, and so I think there's this like natural conflation of like, oh, well, the Chamber of Commerce is just like the subsection of the City Council that like does these things, but it's good to clarify that they're like indeed separate entities.
Well, I think the fact that they're also pretty ubiquitous in cities, like it makes sense why people would come to the conclusion of, oh, well, this is just a part of the city, especially because they tend to serve this very like official role, but they're not necessarily directly under the city. And like in the case of Folsom, it is not like, directly, they don't answer to the City Council.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So like what are some of the topics you want to talk about today?
Yeah, so one thing that we've talked about a little bit in previous episodes is cities are responsible for administrating basic services. So can you touch on that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So I think a lot of the way I like to think about this is like touch points. So, kind of where do, I guess, institutional services interact with your daily life. And so, that's stuff like sewage, right? So whatever goes down the drain or like a toilet and whatnot. There's like water, right? So obviously the water that comes into your home. There's like trash, right? Who picks up the trash on a daily basis? There's also like environmental stuff. So I'm trying to think like what would be an environmental thing that would affect you locally? I guess I'm thinking on like a city level, like just making sure that any sort of like nature preserves are like well maintained and whatnot. And so it's kind of interesting because I think we think about all of these things on like a policy level. Like I think water is like a great example, right? We think of like the drought, California, like are farmers using too much water, or like people having like large lawns and stuff like that. But in reality, the thing that we interface with most is like our actual like city government's, water management like service. Like the actual water department there is in charge of, whether you get a subsidy for like changing your lawn or if there's like quotas or basically like upper limits, during the summer or stuff like that. Even for electricity. I mean, I'm not sure what everyone's like electricity situation is here, but I'm not sure what people's electricity situation is, across the county. Well, outside of Sacramento County. Because I know there's like PG&E, but then there's also like local ones.
And SMUD.
Well, no, SMUD is here, but like I'm curious, like for example, in like LA, right? So like what, like probably PG&E for some things, different stuff for others. Here it's like super local. In that like SMUD, has like the energy generation projects. It's like exclusively limited to the Sacramento County. They don't really have like anyone else. Whereas like PG&E might have like a lot of constituents, and so it's like much less local. And so I guess that's pretty much all I have to say about that without like getting too specific into any one thing. And so appreciate it. Cool. So I guess another interesting part about local government is how they kind of more closely represent their local community. I mean, like almost it's almost like by design, right? Like the smaller the kind of governmental body is, like the more representative they're going to be of that smaller population. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different ways where you get that more direct representation aspect. One of them is if you consider, like, for example, your average city council member that you vote for versus your like assembly member. The amount of people that vote for city council for that one position is going to inherently be a lot less than your assembly member, since they cover a much wider region, and your cities tends, especially in district-based systems like ours, where it's like very focused. So I think there's that more of an element of responsiveness to the public mood in elections, but then also that lends itself to access. So for example, if you need to get something done or you have a policy idea, it's going to be easier for you to schedule a meeting generally with your city council member than going up to like your congressperson. And that's just partly due to the fact that they have those more focused roles localized if you're a constituent. And I think that also speaks to being more responsive to that specific constituency's mood. And then going a step further, when it comes to like the official meetings, like if you wanted to go testify in front of the state assembly or state senate, you potentially can, but there's going to be a lot more people that probably are doing that from a bill-to-bill basis. Whereas, like for example, Darvesh and I, most weeks will go to the city council meeting, and you know there are opportunities for the public to speak, and there's not even someone that's always speaking during those opportunities. Like there's not a whole lot of people that are going to the city council meetings, and by virtue of that, it's a little bit easier to access your city council members, provide your perspective, give public comment, and do so repeatedly. I think at some point we're going to be interested in doing a little bit more of the active participation during the city council meetings, but the fact that we can do that at city council speaks to that responsiveness, that more direct role that citizens will have in our local government.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point. And like one thing I thought of while you were saying that was, it feels like city government is like one of the only places where there's not really like a lobbyist. It feels like, you know, as soon as you get to like a county level, it's like, you know, the point at which you can start having a lobbyist. And I don't even like completely, or I don't even know if I completely think that like lobbying is bad. Like I think it is kind of good. It kind of is in the spirit of like a representative democracy to like some extent. Although I don't know, with like campaign finance laws and stuff, that's like a different like rabbit hole to get into. But it is kind of interesting where like, you know, the size of your city government is like so small that like it is not like financially worthwhile to like hire a lobbyist when you could just like go there yourself. So
well, especially like going back to what we mentioned earlier, the Chamber of Commerce is really here to attract businesses and facilitate that interaction. So there's almost less of a need for special interest groups to be spending money on elections or like trying to lobby anyone. Because things are so accessible, because there's already an interest there where the city is trying to attract people. It's kind of an unnecessary expenditure.
Gotcha. Cool. Is there anything else you wanted to say on that topic, or?
No, I think those are the general points.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So I'm going to move on to determining land use zoning. So
yeah, no, this is an issue that's very important to you, but it's also very important and something that your localities will do. Yes, the state will sometimes have rules around this, but can you touch more on like your local land use zoning?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say like the success of NIMBYism in a way is like a real testament to like how useful this is, or like how much more of an impact this has at a local level than I think people give credit for. You know, like California's passed like a bunch of, you know, to their credit, they have passed a bunch of laws, basically, you know, mandating a certain level of building, you know, for each city. But because this gets like subdivided into hundreds and hundreds of cities, it's kind of hard to enforce naturally. Like I genuinely, some cities, now I'm not gonna like quote any specific ones because I don't want to like kind of mislabel a city as like being compliant or not. But I've heard of cities where they are basically just like, no, like we're just not gonna make this development plan. Like we know we have this quota to build, and we're just not gonna do it. And you know, they have some faith that the state of California is like not really gonna do anything. Which is kind of a fair point. It's like, you know, how are you going to police like all these different cities and their own thing? And also like, you know, to the kind of credit of the cities fighting back, they might say, hey, we have some extenuating circumstances that, you know, don't allow us to build in the same way that, you know, or like, you know, we in, I don't know, Monterey, California cannot build nearly the same as like Modesto, California. It's like our topology is like totally different. Building cost is like totally different. So, you know, like how could you expect us to build the same as like, you know, those people. And yeah, so I think it's interesting in that because it's so local, it's almost like so fractured, but in a way that can be to people's benefit. In that, like, if you want to make an impact, you actually have a pretty good chance of making an actual impact.
Yeah.
Meaning that, you know, if your city is the kind of last entity that's deciding this like zoning stuff, if you change it at the source, then you know it's kind of like change for everyone, and in theory for the better, or in theory in line with whatever your viewpoint of land use zoning is in general. So it's one of those kind of bright spots of like optimism in local city government, where you're kind of like, oh, I can like very visually and lastingly change my community in a way that not only I see, but that I can like point out to others. Sometimes like a lot of politics gets like very esoteric, and then you're like, well, I changed like this subsection of this law, and so like when this thing happens, then this kicks in, and it can feel kind of distant from people. But I think a lot of people can tell like, hey, I like the Folsom Historic District, and ever since they like rezoned some of the area and built these things, I really like visiting there. Yeah. So I was like, a lasting change that really benefited me personally and the people I know. So yeah, I don't know. That's kind of like a word of encouragement, I guess, to get involved in local politics.
Yeah, no, I mean, zoning is super impactful and important because it really shapes the future of the city.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned NIMBYs. Can you explain a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah. So I feel like I mentioned it before, but so NIMBYism is I'm sort of using it pejoratively in like a joking way, but I also want to like recognize their arguments and steel man it as much as possible. Yeah. So NIMBY stands for not in my backyard, and the sort of like acronym comes from this idea that whenever you propose a change that is sort of like kind of this like collectivist benefit, or like an increase in like housing density more specifically, because it relates to housing, there people are basically like, oh, that's a fantastic idea. I would love to build a homeless shelter. I would love to build below market rate housing. But could you not do it in my backyard? Could you not do it near where I am? Could you go do it somewhere else? And this is actually, correct me if I'm using this incorrectly, but it feels like a prisoner's dilemma.
It does. Yeah.
Kind of, yeah, where basically, because everyone is saying that individually, it's like no one's backyard is being built in, and so none of this stuff ever really gets built. Yeah. And so there's kind of like a countervailing movement called like YIMBY, like yes in my backyard.
Yeah, there's also an organization, California YIMBY.
Yeah, exactly. So like a lot of organizations, and I mean to the NIMBY's credit, it's like a very grassroots thing, and I can really sympathize with the arguments because it speaks to, I think, a lot of American values and a lot of the kind of principles that America espoused at its founding, right? Because like if you're someone who's like a homeowner, you're like, hey, this is my equity. I paid for this. I own this, and in a world of increasing like subscriptions and stuff like that, it's like one of the few things where you're like, I can't move my house. Like the house is where it is.
So what you're saying is there's an economic component to it.
I think, definitely there's an economic component. I think the economic component is like frankly a bit misguided, because I think the equity that you get in your home is like not real money. I think. I mean, it's not real money unless you downsize your home. Meaning that like, I buy.
It's a fixed asset. Is that what you're referring to?
I guess what I'm saying is like the bank, wouldn't even give you that money if you asked for it without like interest. Right. So like in.
You mean like a second mortgage?
No, not even like a second mortgage. I mean like a home equity line of credit or something like that. So let's say you bought your home for like $400,000 and appreciated to $800,000. Like, oh wow, I gained $400,000 in value. And maybe before like the recent interest rate hikes, you were like, oh, I can borrow. The bank will like lend you that remaining $400,000 at whatever, like a pretty low interest rate. Pretty much like the mortgage interest rate. Yeah. But the whole issue here is that like you don't get those $400,000. Like it's a loan. Like you still have to pay it back. Yeah. So you don't ever realize that money unless you like sell your home. And then by the time you're selling your home, everyone else's houses have appreciated. Yeah. So like the nominal difference to you is like pretty much non-existent. And not only that, but because of like property taxes, that equity is just being taxed away like every year. Like California, taxes you based on the assessed value of your home. So even though you have not realized that equity in your like actual checking account or anything, you still get charged 1% on that hypothetical 800,000 number instead of the 400,000 that you bought it.
Well, that's where Prop 13 comes in though, because then that assessment only happens basically when ownership of the home is sold. So for example, it's like grandfathered in. If you've lived in this home for like 40 years, you're still paying that initial assessed value in property taxes rather than like what may be reflective of current market rates.
Yeah, I mean, that's true, but I actually don't know like all the details of Prop 13. I know it was like passed in like the 80s or something.
I think, yeah, maybe late 70s, around then.
Yeah, but I think it creates this. Part of the issue is that I think the bottom rungs of the ladder have been removed partly because of that. I mean, it works in like a nepotistic way, right? Like, I mean, as it should, right? Like your family should be like the immediate beneficiaries of this type of thing. But now because the housing rates are rising so fast, it's something like 10 to 17%, on a per annum basis. So people's wages are not going up that fast.
Yeah.
And I don't think they ever have been going up that fast. And not only that, but like with inflation. So it's kind of like, okay, well, you're just kind of creating this almost like protected, elite of landowners. I mean, it's very, weirdly enough, it's like very reminiscent to a lot of the like 20th century land reform arguments in like other countries. I mean, compared to like places like Vietnam or like China or something like that, where there's obviously like a pretty violent revolution to redistribute land and things like that. And like obviously the two situations are like not equivalent. But I'm saying that there's like a common problem in history that comes up is that like people like to vote themselves power. Like, the incumbents always like to vote themselves into like sort of power and create an inertia for other people to like not take what they have.
Yeah.
And it's like totally understandable. It's like I sympathize with it completely. But at the same time, it like creates this fragility in society, I think, because now you have like a new generation of people, if they can't afford a home, and they're just like renting, their money's not really going to equity. That means they're not putting their money in like stocks and retirement and stuff like that. Those things trickle over into endowments for schools or charitable contributions or places like St. Jude's, right, which like do research and stuff like that. So it has this like very long tail of effects, I think.
Well, I think the snowball effect of generational wealth is a good example of that. Especially as you have, it would be great if in a like ideal system, 100% of people like will be able to inherit something from their parents. But I mean, unfortunately, that also sometimes works in the debt way as well, whereas like people are responsible for some of the debts that their parents couldn't pay.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that there's all these underlying economic inequities in our society, they compound to an extent because of laws like this.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. I mean, this is definitely not really just local government, but like the carried interest loophole and all this kind of like weird financial chicanery that like people can do. It just doesn't really. I mean, I respect anyone who like makes. I don't feel like there should be like a cap on like wealth and stuff. Like I feel like that's kind of like a dumb way to go about it. But yeah,
what do you think about like a wealth tax though?
I'm okay with a wealth tax. I mean, from stuff like France, I know France implemented this in maybe like the 2010s or something, and they just had like a net egress of enough wealthy-ish people that it was like a net harm, not net harm, but like a net deficit to the
bottom line.
Yeah, to the tax revenue. That basically you're like, okay, well, if you're rich, like you have the means to go anywhere. So it's always going to be like a race to the bottom kind of thing.
Well, do you know like how what was the scale of the wealth tax there, if you know?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I think
it seemed really onerous.
Honestly, it didn't seem super onerous. But I think the difference is that for like everyday people, it's like you're not just gonna like get up and like uproot your life and like move to it. I mean, there's all these like Californians who are like, I'm gonna like move to Texas because of like taxes or whatever. And it's like, I mean, fine, some of them did, but like, realistically, none of us want to be in that situation where we're just like, oh, it's this like, yeah, again, like a race to the bottom of like, oh, where's like the cheapest, because it's like then everyone would just move to Wyoming. Yeah. It's not like this. It's not like this almost like economic like game theory model where everyone's like thinking like 10 steps ahead, like, oh, what's the game theory optimal move of like which house to buy and what mortgage rate to get. It's like people have just other things to worry about.
Yeah, I mean, shoot, if you just want to like move in near your family, like that's such a
exactly.
not necessarily economic interest.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, we'll leave it at that, and we can go more into like real estate and stuff in a future episode. So yeah, kind of wanted to move on to like economic planning and economic plans themselves for the or at a local government level, and what makes that a particularly special place. And maybe I'll tee it up a little bit by saying I think that a lot of us sense that the almost like high level platitudes that we get from politicians about like the economy are you know, they're just that. They're just like these platitudes. Because I think a lot of people, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I always got the sense that I was like, how do you guys even know, like, what are you going to do? Right? Like what actually do you mean? Or, you know, they'll be like, oh, we want to bring like gas down or something like that. And you're like, like what? There's like oil tankers that, you know, are scheduled like 6 months in advance or something. Like how does it actually materialize into, you know, what I'm paying at the pump or something like that? So do you think that in local governments that the situation is somewhat unique and, you know, maybe more, I don't know, transparent in some way?
Well, so I'll start with two thoughts on that. On the broader aspect of, you know, people getting elected to office, having these big economic goals, the thing about the economy is really complex. So there's a lot of things that affect it, whether that be domestic issues, technology, international politics, and economic results usually take a long time to materialize. So the like promises that people will make of like, oh, like under like my administration you're gonna have like a booming economy, like sometimes yes, that's the case, but it's not always because of their effort. Sometimes it's 1, 2, 3 people before them, because things, particularly for some like the more long-term policy levers, they take a long time to actually like affect the system and change the economy. Whether that be, you know, the shifting of wealth, the incentive for people to start new businesses. Like for example, if you start a new business, you're not necessarily going to be a Fortune 500 company day one.
Yeah.
Like that'll take years usually to build up. And like creating new opportunities, creating new big projects from the government, those things also have a lot of infrastructure that needs to go into them. So for example, like if you're going to start an oil pipeline, you can't build that in a year, like especially if it's cross country. So I would say that generally about the bigger picture, but then moving down locally, it's a little bit simpler in the sense that, you know, the city of Folsom doesn't have as many policy levers for the economy that like the governor would have or the president of the United States, where a lot of the like budget is focused on administration, and then there's also the aspect of what your local businesses are, who your local residents are. So you know, on the sales tax and like property tax side, as we discussed in our previous episode, those things are kind of static, property taxes especially. So the city can do long-term planning in terms of like, oh, like how are we going to zone? How are we going to maximize what kind of homes are built? What kind of people are attracted to come here? But those things definitely take a long time to materialize. And sales tax is also a good example of something that's a little bit more acute to the economy that necessarily isn't controlled. Like for example with COVID, when that really hit sales tax here in the city, like there was very little that the city could do. Like sure, they could facilitate businesses staying open or try to mitigate the spread of the virus as much as possible to help the local economy, but at the same time, the city's not necessarily very in a powerful position to do that. I think the long-term economic plans, therefore, like also serve two different roles. There's the fiduciary like side where the city is like, okay, like how do we consider like what revenue we're expecting long term, what kind of businesses we're going to have versus what services we provide, and that's just more speaking to like fiscal planning that the city manager will be doing a lot of. But then there's also the role that the Chamber of Commerce can help facilitate, where it's like, okay, long term, what kind of businesses do we want to attract? What kind of policies can we like work with the city to get implemented, so that way businesses are interested in coming here, so that more revenue is coming in. Potentially, like, you know, we have more of a professional class that's attracted to move into the new home. So there's definitely that complementary nature there with economic planning, but it's definitely it's a very complicated issue, and it's like you can make all the plans you want, but you can't see the future.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there were economic plans going into the COVID era, and I'm guessing that not all their goals were met because of it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, do you think that? Yeah, I feel like you laid it out in a very descriptive way, which is that you have these like kind of less knobs and dials to turn, but in doing so, it kind of makes your process a bit simpler.
Yeah.
And that like, if you don't have this like clairvoyance of like what, you know, because I'm sure like the state of California or the federal government do have like, you know, pandemic preparedness units or, you know, all these sort of like kind of situation planning things. But, you know, at like a local level, you can't really afford to do that. So do you think, I guess, do you think that's like a net benefit to a city in terms of like, okay, like even though we're limited, that limitation is actually kind of makes it much easier to get these projects underway. Like an argument I could see there is, you know, if we want to repave a road, you know, typically nobody's really going to be obstructing that. right? They're going to be like, hey, like I drove on that road, I want it to be better. Sure,
Yeah.
why not? Like it's not going to cost you much. Go ahead. Whereas I don't know. I mean, I'm thinking of just the litany of kind of tense issues around I don't know school policies in California, right? Like that's such a hairball of an issue to kind of get entangled in, and but to some extent, the city not being able to get into it might be like a net benefit. So I don't know. What do you think on that?
I would say, based on my understanding, I mean, obviously everything depends.
Yeah, of course.
I would say I generally would agree with you in the sense that at least at the city level, it's a lot more that you're responding to things rather than you're actively planning them.
Right.
Because larger demographic trends from the state, for example, the city of Folsom right now is benefiting from an influx of people that are moving east from the Bay, and that's been really helpful and not necessarily something the city has planned for, but it's at the end of the day really enabling them to like offer more services with the increased tax revenue, really driving up property values, and it's just a net benefit. That being said, it could very easily be the opposite, where the city's just kind of at the mercy of the larger demographic trend and they can do what they can to incentivize people to stay. But by the time you get to such a large scale like the city of San Francisco or San Jose, I'm not super familiar with their governance systems, but at the same time, you have so many large industries that are based in those cities that, for example, if Apple just decided to move out of Silicon Valley, the city can try to incentivize them to stay, but if it's just like because the CEO made a decision or the board of directors made a decision, then they're really at the mercy of that, and that's going to be a huge problem for them.
Yeah.
So it's nicer that it's simpler in the sense that you're really just responding with the fewer levers that you have, but you also have less ability to influence the outcome as compared to like the state or the national government.
So would you say in a way it's like almost more democratic because like each sort of constituent doesn't have like enough power to basically have some like single-handed, maybe not direct. I guess the closest thing I could see in Folsom is like Intel. Like if Intel moved out, like I think that would be a pretty big deal. Granted, I don't think it would probably be to the same magnitude as like Apple and like Cupertino. That's like existential.
Yeah.
Like they built this like spaceship campus and they were just like they're like we're gonna like move to Florida or something. It's like the weather's nice. So that's so interesting. Do you think it's like almost a natural fate of a city to get to that point?
Or like it's so big, is that what you mean?
Yeah, or kind of like it's almost like the terminal state of a city is like you're this some big thing happened to be there and you kind of like lucked out, or
I don't know. I feel like that's hard to say because different eras of, like, for example, the United States have looked different in terms of where people tend to live. So, for example, in the 50s, we had the expansion of the suburbs and a lot of people moving out of the cities versus where now it kind of feels like we might have a little bit of a reversal there where a lot of people, like, especially in our generation, are moving to the cities because that's where work is.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily think it's this destiny of cities to get to this point where they're so unwieldy big that they can't necessarily have as many controls. But at the same time, I think it's also a reflection of the way that our economy has been structured, where there is this, explosive growth of super powerful businesses, some would argue monopolies, that because of the way that our framework of laws has enabled individual companies and individuals themselves to have this explosive growth of wealth and rising income inequality. I think it's been facilitated by those decades of policies that could also be reversed by new policies over the course of decades, of course, because economic policies take a while to manifest. But to something you did mention earlier, I do think cities are more democratic in the sense that, especially in a city like Folsom, where we have a weaker system that we've discussed what that means earlier, there's not as much of a one person driving the ship. It is really the broader trends of the city and what the city residents want in their leadership at city council.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, that's all the questions I had. Is there anything else you wanted to say on the topic that wasn't related to?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Here, let me ask you a question now.
Sure.
So we talked about economic plans, but maybe jumping to something a little bit more tangible. One of the other things that cities do is they provide for parks and recreation. So, for example, we have the Parks and Recreations here in Folsom. Could you expand a little bit on Parks and Rec?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I feel like for pretty much everything is self-explanatory. What I mean to say is I think for everything that you could imagine Parks and Rec doing, it's relatively straightforward. I will say, it is one of those things where I feel like its impact could be studied and quantified a bit better. I think we all have this intuition. Actually, sorry, I'm gonna stop saying it that way as if like this is like this universal thing. But I have this intuition that people recognize that Parks and Rec has this externality to it, where it increases the quality of life in a city or a suburb or wherever. In this kind of like nebulous way, but we all kind of feel it. Like we're like, oh hey, that the park is nice. Like the trees just look really good. It just feels good to be in this area, to be living in this area. This is like somewhere where I want to raise my kids. We've like brought up multiple times how Folsom attracts a lot of young families, and so something like a nice park is a huge selling point because like your child isn't just gonna like sit at home like all day. I mean, ideally. So like good schools, like school is gonna be a good chunk of where they spend their time. We live in California, so the weather's pretty nice a lot of the year. So just having like nice outdoor spaces seems like a pretty prudent thing to invest in. And it is one of those things where like you build a playground and you don't have to like rebuild it every year. There's not like a ton of upkeep per se. And so I don't know. You might like replace the bark every now and then. Maybe like a swing breaks, like you replace it, so on and so forth. So I don't know. Yeah, it feels like one of those things where we all kind of benefit from it, and yet we don't really know how to quantify its effects. Like I'm sure the parks and the landscaping near the historic district, probably plays like a huge role in how much that area thrives. Right, like I'm thinking of all the bike trails and just like the I don't know, just kind of like nice landscaping and just the like I think by the river there's like I don't know, there's like a little alcove where you like rent kayaks and stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
But so I feel like there's probably ways to get a bit of insight into it. Like one idea I've had is there are places which have implemented like a bike or like a pedestrian counter, and so that could be like a really interesting way to check kind of ingress and egress from a park, because a lot of the parks are connected to the trails, which like kind of makes sense, right? Like want to go on a trail, like eventually want to make a regular park or something like that. So that could be kind of an interesting way of how given the population of the residents here, like who could reasonably walk or bike here, and then of those, like how many do we actually see on like a daily basis, and is there some like seasonality to it or that kind of thing?
Well, that's one of the big themes of, like, for example, our perspectives in this podcast is, the more data, the better, and the more informed your policy decisions can be.
Yeah, because it could be something like super innocuous, like, this park has seats, like swings for toddlers, and the other parks don't. And parks that have swings for toddlers actually do, like, get way more pedestrian traffic, because, parents are going to, like, just choose to walk over there or something like that, rather than, like, I don't know, build a playground in the backyard. I mean, I'm like totally making up this example. It might be like a totally contrived example, but you could imagine these kind of things where people's preferences in these kind of like innocuous ways like really add up in the aggregate. And if we just kind of knew how to get a bit of insight into that, we could like improve everyone's quality of life significantly for like pretty low cost. In theory, I mean that's the hope, right? Like, is there anything else you want to say?
I'll just say, you mentioned the interconnectivity of the city. I think the city planners have done a really good job over the years of making sure that the bike trails do connect all the parks and have done a good job of maintaining all this infrastructure. And that in and of itself makes Folsom a more attractive place to be.
Totally, yeah. So I kind of want to ask you about this topic of administering certain state and federal programs. We've kind of alluded to this, and I think we actually kind of alluded to it in the budget episode, where basically there's a part of the budget that is, is kind of the receiver of federal and state grants. So this is, more often than not, stuff like from HUD, so the Housing and Urban Development Department at like the federal level, or it could be like Caltrans or something like that, like giving a grant to build or expand some kind of like road network or highway. Or I don't know, maybe like subsidy for like the light rail system. I think Folsom's getting like a passing track, so that because I think the frequency right now beyond Sunrise is every 30 minutes, whereas like from Sunrise onwards it's like every 15 minutes. So I think they're adding the passing lane so that the two trains can kind of go back and forth. So those would be things where it happens to be geographically located in Folsom, but like obviously the city of Folsom isn't going to be like, hey, we're just gonna like build a passing track out of like charity or something. So yeah, could you talk a little bit about the role of administering these programs and some of the consequences therein?
Yeah, I think this definitely goes back to what I was saying earlier about the city level government being a little bit more responsive to policy decisions. I think grants are a good example. I mean, sure, you can have people in the city that are really vocal and like go up to those higher levels of state and federal government where you're like, oh, saying, hey, like our city needs this, could you implement this program? But at the end of the day, it really is on the administration that is in charge of your state and local and your federal government to determine what kind of programs there are, and whether that be something like, oh, like I'm going to pass a law saying that cities have to do this, or say, hey, like there's clearly a need for funding for these different localities, so let's pass this big package where it's like we distribute that funding. You mentioned Caltrans earlier. The Biden administration last year passed actually it might have been 2 years ago now, but at the end of the year, they passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, often called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. This was something I worked with a little bit in a previous role, and basically it was this huge financial package where it was a lot of different infrastructure funding that was then trickled down to the states, then down to local transit agencies, where you had your state level transit agencies like Caltrans. They had this process where they worked with a bunch of different localities, local transit agencies, to determine like, hey, where's the most need for these different programs, like, and then they help facilitate that money going down to those localities. So that was an opportunity for local cities to play with money, but at the end of the day, that was also like because the administration had those priorities. So you have some grants and programs that are really just dependent on like, what's the topic at the moment. But then you have some that are more regular, like I think the HUD one that you were mentioning for housing has been more of a regular program, so year after year it's a little bit easier to plan from a city budget perspective because you can expect that money. And then you also have opportunities where there's like this larger pot of funding, for example, at the national level where, say your Department of Energy just has a big grant program that you can apply to. So cities can then invest in positions where they say, oh, hey, you're a grant writer. You're going to be someone who tries to make the city of Folsom competitive to get part of this pot of money. So you'll be like, showing the need in Folsom and why we'd be a good candidate for it, what we would do with the funds, that sort of thing.
Gotcha.
So this is a good example of the city benefiting from, higher up, levels of federalism, having these interests where we can actually get some money. But at the end of the day, also, it's a response. Like we don't necessarily have direct control over what federal grants there are available.
Gotcha. Interesting. I guess from because if I understand correctly, you're like a student assistant at Caltrans for like a while.
Yeah, for 3 months. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I guess how many? I'm curious. What kind of strings are attached to the cities? Because I imagine that whoever is writing the bill has to keep it kind of general enough to account for a lot of the localities and things like that. So, something like an infrastructure. I mean, you take a pretty liberal definition of infrastructure, in that you could be like, hey, this residents of Folsom need childcare, and that's actually like pretty important infrastructure for people in the city to go about their jobs and kind of have improve their quality of life. So is it up to the cities to decide what infrastructure is, or is it like you're getting like $10 million to for an asphalt budget, or any kind of like road improvements specifically? Like so where on the spectrum, I guess, does it lie?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start by just clarifying like my view of infrastructure versus the traditional view. I guess to make it simple, my view of infrastructure is you have the human component, human infrastructure, so that's where you get your things like childcare, that's where you get your things like basic services that enable people to work and go about their daily lives. And then you have your more traditional like economic-based infrastructure, so there's things like roads, bridges, even to an extent like canals. Largely speaking, programs like the one I just mentioned, the IIJA, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, those programs take a lot more of a traditional view of infrastructure, albeit with some, newer environmental components. For example, like establishing resiliency, like improving like electric infrastructure for electric vehicles. But at the end of the day, those programs are also really specific in how they define what infrastructure is. So in the law itself, even though there's a huge funding component, they also include a lot of definitions of what they mean, which is, for practical reasons, like that's how you ensure consistency and implementation throughout the country. But
that kind of makes sense. Like, you know, I can't just call like a gas powered car with like a lead acid battery, like, oh, I have an EV because it like has a battery in it or something like that.
Electric vehicles is a perfect example of you got to define what that means, because there's also like hydrogen vehicles too, which is
right, because there's a difference between like BEVs, like battery electric vehicles, versus like zero emission vehicles, or like,
which I think in that law they do take the route of zero emissions. So I think there is a component where hydrogen vehicles get some funding as well. But then that leads me to the next point where even within the funding, it's not just this, you know, 1 point whatever trillion amount of dollars that is just like, hey, spend it on infrastructure. No, there's like sub funds within that determining, like each state gets a certain amount of money that's like, you know, formulaically determined, where it's like, oh, so and so amount needs to go to bridges and roads. So and so amount needs to go to zero emission vehicle infrastructure. So and so amount needs to go to like these other specialized projects. And even within that, then it's up to the state and stakeholders to determine like what projects are prioritized, whether that funding goes to building new infrastructure, to updating like, you know, bad condition infrastructure, or if it's like maintaining existing infrastructure. So there is a lot of leeway there, but there's also like enough structure from the federal government where it's like they have their priorities on how they want the money to be spent to a certain extent. So using that framework, states and localities got to really work within to determine like what the funding is eligible to be spent on, and then that's where the judgment comes in of like, okay, within that definition, where do we spend the money?
Gotcha. Okay, that's so fascinating. I'm like, I don't know why this reminds me, but I went to like the Railroad History Museum in Sacramento, and one interesting thing was that when like Leland Stanford was being commissioned to build like the sort of transcontinental railroad, the way it was actually funded was like quite literally a milestone based funding, in that like he would get or like his company, or like whatever the case may be, would get like a government bond for every like X amount of miles that he built.
Okay.
So they would have to like prove like, we built from like here to here, you can like run the train from here to here, and they'd be like, you know, we'll send you a I don't know, like $10,000 or something like that. So I'm kind of curious, what role do you think milestone based funding, whether literal or figurative, you know, could have in this situation? Because I think a lot of the to kind of voice some of the or voice what I believe to be some of the kind of generic criticisms against this approach, which is that, hey, you know, this is so high level and esoteric that when it actually trickles down, that it just becomes like a grift for like a few companies, or like, you know, because these kind of giant sums of money are being given out, it's like only the kind of most well rehearsed consultants and companies will, you know, sort of like get that bag of money and then not really deliver on like the best value for the citizens of that like area. So and I think that to round out the criticism, I think the kind of proposed solution from that critique is that, hey, we should set up, you know, much clearer milestones, and, you know, if companies hit those milestones, then and only then they should be kind of rewarded.
Yeah, I have two kind of thoughts about that. There's the front end work and the back end work, and just because I think you kind of talked on it a little bit more, the back end work is where you have to do this like reporting mechanism to show how the money is being spent, both during the process and at the end of it, which, you know, at the end of the day is really just an accountability measure. Like, we don't want to just have these huge sums of money goes out and it's like, oh, we hope it gets spent. The government has a role in like making sure that that money goes where it needs to be, to one, facilitate, you know, future funding programs, but two, like to hold people accountable. I don't know to what extent in the United States or in the state of California there's like that element of corruption where that money is being misappropriated, but it does seem like these back end programs of accountability mitigate that. And then on the front end, as you spoke about at the end there, there's been this movement to a little bit of an extent at the national level, but I feel like the state of California has done a better job of leading this charge, of trying to specify how you spend that money from an equity-based lens. So, for example, you can say, oh, like, here's how we've defined this category of what we consider to be disadvantaged businesses or enterprises. You can then say, okay, so of this pot of money for like this whatever project, we want, say, 50% of it to go to what we define as disadvantaged business enterprises. So that's one way where you can kind of mitigate, you know, the advantage that like really well-financed organizations and entrance organizations may have. But I think that's more of a recent movement. So whether or not that's been super effective is kind of hard to say at this point.
Gotcha. But yeah, I mean that seems to be in. Seems like the spirit is there.
Yeah.
Of basically being like, hey, let's tilt the scales in favor of people who would normally not have access to this kind of capital or this kind of like funding and stuff like that. And in theory, hopefully it's like a one-time thing, and they can like kind of create a more equitable landscape overall.
Yeah.
Cool, awesome. Is there anything else you wanted to say about that? Or?
No, I think that's good. That's I feel like a lot of the things that we're talking about also overlap, so you get more of a complete sense of like the role of a local city government to really administer what's coming down from the top.
Yeah.
There's a lot of top-down systems in the United States.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to the point earlier too, where it's like, okay, well, like the more local you get, like the less chance you have of. And I actually don't know if this is like strictly probabilistically true, but it seems to me that you would have a much lower propensity for lobbying. Kind of like the more local you go. So in a way, like allocating these really small sums of money to like a bunch of different places seems kind of much better from kind of just making the corruption hard. And like, I mean, someone who's that corrupt would have to be really well organized, and then at that point I'm like very envious of whoever is coordinating that kind of effort. But yeah, like in reality, no one's going to like, I don't know, Eureka, California, and then like Folsom, California, and be like, I want to use like this asphalt contractor or something like that. It's so.
Oh, I think that's a good segue for a contrast. Things are typically very top down when it comes to administering grants, but like without getting into a lot of detail, because this is a very meaty issue that we're going to cover later on, local school districts are a lot more decentralized.
Yeah. So
could you talk a little bit more about like why local school districts are an important issue for local governments?
Yeah, I mean, this seems like one of the. It seems so politically charged. Perhaps even before COVID, but I think acutely during COVID, because we sort of realized the role that schools play in not just this. I think we almost like took it for granted that like during most of human civilization we did not have like universal education. It is a relatively recent phenomenon, and it is actually quite fragile in that like we can't just like let it rot and expect it to continue functioning. Also, what was kind of eye-opening was how many students got like a significant portion of their meals through schools, and how doing kind of like remote schooling really affected, had all these secondary, tertiary effects and things like that. So I think it's probably important for a lot of reasons. It can get politicized in this very kind of cringe way where you're like, think about the kids, but I mean, in reality though, like that is a huge reason why someone would move to a city in the first place. Like even within, I mean, I can tell you even within like New York, like people really choose their neighborhoods, if they have kids, like based on what kind of school district it is. Yeah. Because it could literally be like one street over where you're like, oh man, my quality of life is great, but like my school sucks. And then on the other hand, it could be like the exact opposite, or you could get both, the best of both or something like that. And I think with New York, there's like a complication with charter schools and things like that. And then, obviously if you're living anywhere and, you're, you have the means to, send your kids to a private school, like, obviously the world is your oyster at that point. Yeah. But I think it's one of those things where it really can't be decoupled from the locality. It's all like you go to school in a physical place. I mean, we've tried the remote learning thing. It seems like it empirically hasn't worked as well as people hoped it would. Unlike remote work, which seems to have some stickiness to it. So for whatever reason, it is like a very local thing, and it's probably going to stay a very local thing. So it's kind of prudent to invest in it. I was going to make another point, but it's kind of slipping my mind.
No worries. If you think of it before we move on to the next point, one thing I want to add to that is the thing about school districts is they're somewhat of a, like if you look at a map, for example, of the school district that Folsom's in, which is...
We should make an overlay for
yes, we should totally do that for Folsom maps. But we belong to Folsom Cordova Unified School District. So it's not solely based in the city of Folsom. It's a composite between Folsom and Rancho Cordova area and everything in between. So the city of Folsom itself doesn't like directly say like, oh, here's like what we want the school district to teach or whatnot. The school district is something of its own kind of political entity, and you have the what's the electeds for school district? School board. So you have your school board that's elected in their own election that do determine a lot of the policy for the school district. But it's not just the city of Folsom residents voting, for example. Then it's also everyone else in the Folsom Court of Unified Territory.
Gotcha. Interesting. I guess, do you think that school districts tend to like agglomerate over time or like subdivide into smaller districts?
That is a meaty question, and one that I think we should save for
Okay.
a dedicated school district episode, because there's a lot to talk about with school districts. That's a huge issue.
Interesting. Like, could you allude to some of the topics? Because I guess for me, I'm honestly just thinking about it in terms of like, you know, how much money gets allocated to like administrative costs versus like actual teaching. And also, I guess the way I think about it too is like, I just feel like pedagogy needs to change pretty significantly. It feels like we're operating on a model that was, you know, weirdly enough, like built for a primarily agrarian society. Like the fact like summers are off because that's like harvest season one. I like it. That seems kind of asinine and weird to me. That despite so much like rapid technological advancement, we keep this like rather arcane system for education. So yeah, what are some of the issues that maybe people are not immediately aware of that, you know, you could kind of have like as like a teaser for that topic?
Well, okay, I'll just say in the context of Folsom, throughout the decades, there have been several movements to break up the school district.
Interesting.
And whether or not it was Rancho Cordova's end of the school district or Folsom's end pushing it has changed over time. And
interesting.
From what I know and what can be discussed in a later episode, demographics and where the finances have been in the district is something that seems like has been correlated.
Interesting. Okay, I have no idea, but no, it's good to know.
Well, I mean, that kind of leads into the next thing that I was hoping to talk about, which is one of the other roles of city governments is to like work on preserving local history. And without super getting into this, because you know I know this episode's starting to get kind of long, and sorry about maybe misleading our listeners in the beginning, thinking it was going to be short.
I was like half of my bad because I just like end up like thinking of these questions on the spot, and I'm like, oh man, like seems like a pretty interesting topic.
Well, I mean, I think all the points we've been making so far have been really on the issue.
True.
So hopefully this is really informative and helpful for you know explaining why local government and involvement in it is so important. But back onto local history, you know, you have some of the things that we've already been talking about. For example, during city council meetings, like whether or not we designate a tree as historic and of value, therefore, is one of the roles of city government, and that to an extent is like interrelated with zoning. But at the end of the day, like it is like the local residents that have a role in determining what they like want to preserve for the future generations. And you know, you have the Folsom Historic Commission, for example. You have the Folsom Historical Society, which I believe is a nonprofit. So you have a bunch of different organizations that are really interested in like preserving the history of a place like Folsom, like especially downtown Folsom, Old Folsom, Sutter Street. But I won't speak on that a whole much because I feel like that, you know, preserving of history is somewhat self-explanatory. Whether or not something is considered of historical significance depends on the population, and I think that's what should be the case. Like, really, like, who is to say from someone from, like, say, LA, like, what is historically of value in Folsom versus the people who have lived here for generations?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it kind of makes me think now of, like, I guess all history is kind of local on some level. It has to exist at, like, the sub-city level.
Well, I mean, I think for Folsom, like, you know, you do have more national organizations like national parks. But like we're not really gonna be a UNESCO World Heritage Site anytime soon. So there's not really much of a role for anything other than local government. No, I guess I was thinking like in terms of cities, like it's rare that a whole city will be deemed like historic, right? It's like a city always keeps like part of its history, and then you know part of it is like evolving and stuff like that. And so I don't know, it's always an interesting tension of like what do you decide to keep. What do you renovate? Like, is it renovated in the spirit of the, you know, historical significance? Well, that's where I think a place like Folsom has a little bit more of an advantage of determining what is versus non-historic.
That's a good point,
versus some place that's really like geographically like defined and you can't grow as much, like San Francisco. Because like we have this old core area of Folsom that's been here since the city's founding, and then we're expanding outwards geographically because there's a lot of different land we can expand onto. But like when you're really confined to a tight space, then that conversation of what's historic versus not gets a little more contentious.
That's a good point. Yeah, do you keep the foundation? Do you keep the building? Like all this kind of stuff. Pretty interesting.
So the last thing that I think I want to ask you about is one of the other things that is similar about the city administering versus coming from the national government down is the census. Well, maybe the city's not the right term because I think usually it's done at the county level, but Can you speak to the importance of the census and why that's like good data?
Yeah. I think I actually don't know if the city level collects any more data about the census. Like I don't know if it gets more granular, or maybe like the more specific you go. But it seems like census data is kind of the most imperative for a city, I would say. For example, because the population of California might not change that much, but if the population of a city goes up or down by 10%, I mean that could be huge, right? Like, I mean, it could be great on one hand. You're like, hey, we have all this extra property tax revenue, but then on the other hand, you might be like, hey, we're not realizing that revenue until years and years down the line. So in the short term, we need to provide the services that these people deserve, like water, sewage, obviously fire departments, like police officers, things like that. So I think in the sense that obviously the data collected is kind of universal, right? Like it can help anyone, but I think the impact it can have is almost like more acute at the city level. So it's kind of imperative that we collect good data. That being said, I think the census is, because it has to cater to such a wide audience, it almost has to be a little bit general. However, I will say like they have implemented some pretty interesting like kind of like data science and like statistical like methods that I find kind of interesting, like a method called like differential privacy.
Oh, what is that?
Basically, the simplest example is like if you have imagine you had like a survey and you had a bunch of people answering like yes or no. You could flip a random proportion of those responses and still maintain a lot of aggregate statistics about the data, as long as you know what proportion you randomly flipped. And so the idea is that for incredibly sensitive questions, like in the census, you could imagine something like
immigration status, maybe.
Exactly. Yeah, immigration status. Maybe what, like, the amount of like total wealth in your household or something. Maybe you don't want to put that in the census because then it's like someone can look in the census and say like, oh hey, how many people who make over $1 million are in this geographical area? Like, probably not that many, and so you might be targeted that way. So I think measures like that were put in place to improve that, which is kind of fascinating. But I will say that like our efforts with like Folsom Maps is an effort to supplement or like augment this kind of census data. So but the census data is important in that it's a good platform. It's kind of a good base, and from that you can build on top of it a lot of things, or you can make the case that because we have this basic information and with this auxiliary information we could actually conclude XYZ, for example. So it's one of those things where kind of makes a good platform. But yeah.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add to that is it really intermixes with some of the earlier topics we mentioned about, like, for example, grants. Like, if you know what your population looks like, it's a little bit easier to determine like how to distribute funds.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, you can almost measure like the per capita expenditure, stuff like that. And so for the last topic, I guess I wanted to talk about, or I wanted to ask you about some of the areas in which local governments kind of like lead certain issues. So I guess you were the one that wrote this down, so I'm kind of curious, what do you mean by that? And then kind of B, could you talk about some of these topics that you listed?
Yeah. So I listed a set of 5 that I felt like were really core local government issues. And I think these are 5 that we're going to really be coming back to a lot in our discussions in this podcast. But they're not necessarily unique to local government. So the 5 that I listed were housing, policing, emergency medical services, local, specifically transit, and then recreation. And these are areas where it's like, yes, like there is housing policies. There's a Department of Housing and Urban Development, for example, at the national level. But at the end of the day, like you can't, it's not really state housing. Like when you consider housing in a city, like it's very like specific and I would say more responsive to the city policies. So I think this is an area where the city really has a lot to lead for, because it's like zoning, like we talked about earlier, is a huge example of what determines that. As we mentioned before, both the previous episodes and in this one a little bit, cities are really like the main administrator in your like life for policy. Policing being a good example of that, where it's like, yeah, you have your city police, and that is one of the biggest budget items of the city, because the city is really the one overseeing that. Then with emergency medical services, like for example, like your local hospitals. So like, you know, where your ambulances are able to like go, located, like how much those fees are, like that's a little bit more responsive at the local level because of our very decentralized medical system, both in the state and the country. Moving on local transit, like yes, the bus system especially in the city of Folsom is something that the city determines. You know, if trying to differentiate a little bit from infrastructure because it's a little bit more throughout all the levels. The city is really responsible for determining like where your bus stops are, like how many buses they have, who's really being served, all that.
Gotcha.
And then lastly, recreation. I think this one's a little bit more self-explanatory. Like when we talk about Parks and Rec, the bike trails throughout the city, like that is something that the city does.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily something the national government will be as interested in.
Yeah, exactly. Or I guess another example, but you know, maybe on the Chamber of Commerce side is like the Folsom Rodeo.
Yeah.
It's like that's not going to be a top-down thing. Like the state of California isn't going to be like, you know what, like certain cities should have a rodeo and should have like these fairs and things like that. So
or like the jazz festival, like or
exactly.
farmers markets. That's a perfect example.
Actually, that's like a very like ongoing like you know touch point that a lot of people have kind of experience with, and that's a great example actually.
Okay, well, we made this a really long episode, so I'm just gonna go ahead and try to get your final thoughts, and then I'll offer mine, and then we'll let our listeners get back to whatever they're doing.
I guess my concluding thought would be that I didn't realize like how much of certain topics are just a function of proximity. Like there's no way of getting around it. So you know, like preserving local history, it's like that's just a function of that geographic location.
Yeah,
it can't really be like amortized over you know wide area. You know, school districts, right? You can't just like be educated from like some random suburb like in Virginia or something like that. If you're in California, like there is like an in-person element to it. And so that was kind of the biggest, I guess, eye opener while going through some of these things is that there's a lot more to it than I originally thought.
Yeah, I guess just from my point, big picture, I think the topic of local government, hopefully we've conveyed its importance and all the different things that it does, and I'm sure we didn't, you know, offer an exhaustive list. There's a lot more to talk about, both within what we've discussed as well as just other topics we didn't cover. But local government is, you know, the most responsive form of government to the individual citizen. It's something that isn't necessarily as sexy as state or national politics, but I think it's also, you know, I don't want to make a judgment call when it's equally important or not, but I think it's fair to say that it is very important and very impactful in your day-to-day life. So hopefully our listeners have a little bit of an appreciation for like all the different things local government does, as well as like its importance. And, you know, in the vein of, you know, people say that the states are like laboratories of democracy, I do think your local government is like the most accessible version of that laboratory. Like what Folsom looks like and what the Folsom government does is going to be very different from like your bigger cities, Sacramento, San Francisco, LA, as well as your more rural areas like say Placerville or like up north.
That's a great point. It's a great place to conclude. So we'll see you guys next time.
All right, thanks.
Bye. Cool.